On May 29, 1453, the fortress of all fortresses, Constantinople, the new Rome, fell. Many have lamented the fate of all Christendom following this tragedy, but no one speaks of why it fell and what the historical reality was at the time when Mehmed II, a 22-year-old sultan, managed, using the cannons of the Hungarian Orban from Brașov, in present-day Romania, to bring down the famous walls that had kept so many besieging armies at bay and to enter the city. The historical reality is a very sad one, and one rarely spoken aloud. Constantinople was indeed the new Rome, truly the capital of a Christian empire for more than 1,000 years, save for an interruption in the 13th century, which is seldom mentioned. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople was the greatest city in the world, with a population of between 400,000 and 500,000 people, the majority of whom were Orthodox Christians. These Christians came from all the provinces of the Roman Empire, and their access to the military, administrative, and ecclesiastical structures was equally open and free, based on each person's education, talent, and dedication. The great tragedy of Constantinople begins sometime in the 9th century, when, amid an exceptional revival of the sciences and Christian philosophy, supported by a series of military conquests, there emerged what would later be called Greek nationalism, specifically the confusion of the Greek language Christian culture with political ideals. One cannot help but feel sorrow that the Hellenophone Romans of Constantinople could be enchanted by an idea that had never ensnared even the Macedonians of Alexander the Great, nor the scholars and politicians of ancient Rome, most of whom spoke ancient Greek, the language of Roman culture, until around 200 AD. The temptation of Greek nationalism was followed by a series of tragedies, such as that of Emperor Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, who led what we would today call a phenomenon of chauvinism. Bulgarians and Serbs were banned from holding positions in the Roman Empire's army and administration under threat of death. This precedent paved the way for similar attitudes to be directed toward other ethnic groups. A little later, during the reign of the Comnenus emperors, a true ethnic cleansing began, with the Vlachs suffering first, as they were the most numerous. In 1182, the Latin Roman Catholics were also expelled, and those who remained in the city were massacred. In 1185, the emperor imposed new taxes on the Vlachs and Slavs of the Balkans, in contrast to the Greeks in the city, which led to the great uprising of the Asen brothers and the emergence of the Vlach-Bulgarian Empire in 1187. A series of wars definitively sealed the fate of the unity of the Constantinopolitan Empire. After the assassination of John Asen in 1196, his younger brother, Ioan Kaloyan, took the initiative and succeeded in further expanding the Vlach-Bulgarian rule, which had meanwhile become the true new Rome. As a result of Constantinopolitan Greek chauvinism, the Vlachs and South Slavs decided to found a new empire, having Old Church Slavonic as the official administrative and ecclesiastical language. At the arrival of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, Ioan Kaloyan, the Vlach-Bulgarian emperor, offered his support to the Latins to punish the Greeks in the city. The great shock came when the Latins began looting and killing. April 12, 1204, marked the beginning of a massive genocide and the greatest robbery in human history for Constantinople. If today's Western Europe exists as a financial power, it is largely due to the loot taken from Constantinople in 1204. The Greek chauvinism in Constantinople was the triggering factor of this tragedy. Chauvinism was the main reason for the disappearance of the Eastern Roman Empire. Therefore, the true fall of Constantinople was on April 12, 1204. After the disastrous year of 1204, which also meant the shattering of any dream of Christian unity, Constantinople remained only a shadow of what it once had been, its only notable historical influence after that year being ecclesiastical. Ioan Kaloyan immediately turned his weapons against the Latins, seeing the unimaginable looting and the atheism of the Latin invaders. In the following year, 1205, Kaloyan defeated and captured the leader of the Fourth Crusade, Baldwin of Flanders. Kaloyan died in 1207 during the siege of Latin Thessaloniki, following an assassination. It is worth noting here the Greek chauvinism, which after 1207 depicted Saint Demetrius the great martyr, the spiritual patron of Thessaloniki, in an icon holding a spear, killing Kaloyan, although today very few art historians can provide the correct explanation for that representation. From a population of more than 400,000 inhabitants at the end of the 12th century, Constantinople dwindled to around 50,000 inhabitants, mostly Catholics. Only in 1261 did the Greeks manage to recapture the city, with great effort. What followed were several decades of political and ecclesiastical compromises, about which little is usually said. These compromises were the ones that, once again, led to the fragmentation of the Orthodox mindset within the borders of the former Roman Empire. Unfortunately for the ideal of Christian unity, chauvinism again played its part after 1261. Although there were no longer ethnic purges, the capital became almost exclusively Greek, and ties with the rest of the Orthodox Christians in the former empire were reduced to a minimum. The city's population never exceeded 70,000 inhabitants until the Ottoman conquest. As mentioned previously, the political compromises after 1261 divided both the political and later the ecclesiastical world. Most of the nobles and those who had access to the reins of power believed that by aligning with the Catholic West, they would succeed in saving the empire, which had now become a Greek empire. Another faction, unfortunately a minority, advocated for abandoning chauvinism and strengthening the apostolic Christian Orthodox teachings, a strengthening through which the old Roman imperial rule could be restored. With a few small exceptions, such as those related to Saint Gregory Palamas, Metropolitan of Thessaloniki, and the Holy Patriarchs Isidore, Callistus I, and Philotheus, who were supported by the imperial Cantacuzene family, the majority of Constantinopolitan emperors after 1261 suffered from unionism and placed their hope more in the Western military power than in God. Looking back at the biographies of the emperors between 1261 and 1453, a knowledgeable historian of the Christian Roman Empire cannot help but wonder how they missed the very essence that had brought God's blessing upon the empire, namely, the Christian state guided by the Holy Gospel and the Holy Ecumenical Councils, proclaiming a Christian culture, art, and science throughout its territory and in the rest of the known world, united by a single liturgy served in the language of the respective peoples or in another classical language where the written culture of a people was not sufficiently developed. Repeatedly, the emperors, besides forming military and matrimonial alliances with various ruling houses in Western Europe, tried to establish permanent ties with the Vatican in an attempt to regain their former territories through the Crusades. We can only be amazed that they did not understand that these Crusades only apparently aimed to restore the Christian empire, their true purpose being plunder in all its forms and the replacement of the Orthodox hierarchy with the papal one. Ultimately, in 1438, Emperor John VIII Palaeologos traveled to Italy for the Council of Ferrara, together with the Patriarch of Constantinople and the most representative hierarchs of the Church from within and outside the empire. For example, Metropolitan Damian of Suceava and Metropolitan Isidore of Kiev were also present. After a year of discussions, during which the plague appeared and the council was moved to Florence, all the divergences between the Apostolic and Eastern Orthodox teachings and the Latin innovations were analyzed, and regardless of how many apostolic and patristic arguments were brought up, the sound traditional teaching of the Church was set aside under various pretexts. The Orthodox hierarchs were forced to sign the union with the Vatican. Under political and even armed pressure, most signed, thereby apostatizing. Only one hierarch, Saint Mark of Ephesus, refused to sign, remaining faithful to the apostolic teaching. The emperor and the hierarchs returned home after signing their own apostasy. Even though, upon arriving in Constantinople, they took all measures to impose the union, the Church maintained its own worship, but the Pope was commemorated at all services. The Creed was recited with the addition of the Filioque, and all Greek clergy were required to concelebrate with the Latins. A large part of the population refused the union, rallying around the monk Gennadius Scholarius and a few like-minded clerics. God favored the few who preserved the Orthodox conscience and opposed this coercion of the Church's faith. Most of the archbishops outside the empire, and some within it, refused the union. The signatories of the union were expelled from their episcopal seats, especially those outside the Greek Empire. This happened in Kiev and Suceava. The metropolis of Târgoviște and Suceava came for a time under the canonical jurisdiction of the Archbishop of Ohrid, who remained Orthodox. In 1443, a pan-Orthodox synod was held in Jerusalem, attended by Metropolitan Arsenios of Caesarea Cappadocia and the Patriarchs of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, who condemned and rejected the union and sent a letter of admonition to the Emperor of Constantinople. In Constantinople, the monk Gennadius Scholarius, a leader of the Orthodox faction, had written on his door, "Better the Turkish turban than the papal tiara." After the fall of the city, Gennadius Scholarius was appointed Patriarch of the Church of Constantinople and took decisive measures to extinguish the union. In the West, a large part of the Latin bishops rejected the acts of the Council and deposed Pope Eugene IV, electing an anti-pope. In the end, the papacy, despite making great efforts to impose the union, failed to convince the European princes to send armies to save the Greek Empire from destruction. Therefore, between the years 1439 and 1453, a large part of the several tens of thousands of inhabitants of the city, along with the majority of the clergy, were united with Rome, not Orthodox. At the time of its fall, the city of Constantinople was an apostate city. This is the main reason, alongside the reaction to Greek chauvinism, why none of the Orthodox princes from the Balkans or north of the Danube sent their armies to aid the Greeks besieged by Mehmed II. Perhaps rarely in history have there been moments when, within a city or a country, the imminence of disaster and of God's punishment was more evident. It struck the walls of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, extinguishing the shame of unionism for several centuries. This method of severing the Orthodox from their own church was not brought back into discussion at the papal level until the end of the 16th century. From that moment until today, the former city of cities has remained under Islamic rule, and the vast majority of its churches and monasteries have been turned into Muslim mosques.